"We'll share a bed," said the three Apache sisters to the lonely rancher because he helped them. It had been 3 years since the house stopped feeling like a home, yet his body still rose at the same hour it always had when life made sense. The habit remained even though the reason did not. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed for a while, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The winter air had slipped through the wooden walls again during the night. The ranch house was old, and fixing everything alone was impossible. Some mornings he chose which problem mattered most: the cracked window, the loose boards, or the leaking roof, and most mornings he fixed none of them. The silence was the loudest part. Once there had been a second cup on the table, boots beside the door that were not his, and someone who complained about the cold before he even noticed it. Now the only sound was the wind sliding across the plains and the faint shifting of cattle far out in the pasture. Daniel stood, pulled on his coat, and lit the lantern. The soft glow revealed the same small kitchen, the same chair pushed halfway back, untouched since the night he stopped needing it. He made coffee but did not drink much of it. He cooked eggs but left half behind. Food had become something he remembered to make rather than something he wanted. Outside, frost coated the ground in pale silver. His cattle needed checking before the temperature dropped further. Work was the one thing that still kept time moving. Without it, the hours would sit on his shoulders like weight he could not carry. He walked the fence line slowly, boots crunching over frozen dirt. The ranch stretched farther than he could manage alone, but selling it felt like losing the last proof his life had once been full. So he kept repairing, feeding, hauling, counting, day after day, even when the numbers told him the ranch barely held itself together. Around midday, clouds gathered heavy in the north. He watched them while leaning against a post. Snow would come before night. Not the gentle kind either. The air carried that hard bite that meant trouble. He planned to finish quickly and head back. There was no reason to linger outside when no one waited inside. On the way toward the house, he noticed something unusual near the river, crossing movement that did not belong to cattle or wind. At first, he ignored it. Travelers sometimes passed the far trail, but rarely in winter and never close to the ranch. Then he saw the wagon. It stood crooked, one wheel sunk into muddy ground near the riverbank where melting ice had softened the earth. A horse stood tied nearby, head low, sides thin from too much road and too little feed. Daniel paused. Visitors meant questions, and questions meant conversation, something he had learned to avoid because it always led to the same moment, explaining why he lived alone. He almost turned back, but then he noticed the figures beside the wagon. 3 young women, wrapped in worn blankets, trying to push the wheel free though they barely had the strength. One stumbled and caught herself on the wagon rail. Even from a distance, he could see exhaustion in the way they moved. The sky darkened another shade. He sighed quietly. Leaving them there would mean they would not survive the night. The nearest town was too far, and the storm would erase the trail before they reached it. Daniel walked toward them, steps steady but cautious. The horse lifted its head slightly at his approach but made no sound. The women stopped pushing and watched him, not fearful, just tired beyond worry. Up close, their faces showed days without proper rest. Their clothes carried road dust, and their hands were red from cold. The oldest stood a little forward, protective without saying so. "Wheels stuck," she said simply, voice rough from the dry air. Daniel nodded once. "Ground soft here, storms coming fast." They already knew that. He could tell by the way they glanced at the clouds. For a moment, none of them spoke. He was not used to choosing words anymore. Most days he spoke only to animals, and they never needed explanations. Finally he said, "You won't get it out before dark." The youngest sank onto the wagon step, too tired to pretend otherwise. They didn't ask for help. That struck him. Most travelers would have immediately pleaded for assistance, but these 3 only waited as if accepting whatever happened next. Daniel stepped past them, tested the wheel, then studied the ground around it. Even with effort it would take hours they did not have. He wiped his hands on his coat. "Come on, storm will hit before sunset." The middle sister hesitated. "We can pay once we reach town." He shook his head. "Not about that, you'll freeze out here." They looked at each other silently, sharing a conversation without words. Finally the oldest nodded. Daniel untied the horse and led it toward the ranch path. The sisters followed slowly, carrying what little they owned, a small sack, a rolled blanket, and a wooden box carefully held by the youngest. The walk took nearly an hour because of their pace. Daniel shortened his steps without mentioning it. The wind strengthened as they climbed the last rise toward the house. By the time the roof came into view, the first thin lines of snow had begun to fall. Inside, the warmth was weak but better than the open plain. The women paused just inside the doorway, as if unsure how far they were welcome to go. Daniel set another log into the fire and gestured toward the table. "Sit!" They did, carefully, still quiet. He filled a pot with water and added what vegetables he had stored. It wasn't much, but it would be hot. Cooking for others felt strange. His movements were stiff at first, then steadier as memory returned, stirring, tasting, adjusting. The smell filled the small house. The youngest watched the pot with focused attention, the way hungry people do when they try not to appear hungry. Daniel placed bowls before them. They thanked him softly and ate slowly at first, then with growing relief. He sat last, not realizing until then how different the room felt with other people in it. The wind pressed hard against the walls, snow tapping the windows. But inside there was the sound of spoons, the shifting of chairs, and quiet breathing not his own. No one asked about his past. He didn't ask about theirs. For the first time in years, the evening did not stretch endlessly. When the fire settled low, Daniel prepared blankets near the hearth. He kept his words simple. "Rest tonight, roads gone by morning." They nodded, grateful but respectful, careful not to take more space than offered. Daniel blew out the lantern and lay in his room. Through the thin wall, he could hear faint whispers, not secrets, just the comfort of people who were not alone. He stared at the ceiling in the dark. The storm raged outside, but the house felt different, not louder, not brighter, just less empty. And though he would not admit it yet, Daniel slept sooner than he had in many months. Morning came slowly through a gray sky. The storm had not stopped during the night, and snow covered the land so deeply that the fences were only lines under white hills. Daniel woke to a sound he did not recognize at first, a steady knocking rhythm, soft but real. For a moment he thought he had dreamed it. Then he heard it again. He stepped out of his room and stopped in the doorway. The fire had already been lit. One of the sisters knelt beside it, carefully feeding small pieces of wood to build steady heat. Another was at the table, wiping it clean with a damp cloth. The youngest stood near the door, shaking snow from a blanket before hanging it to dry. They noticed him, but did not act embarrassed or uncomfortable. The oldest simply gave a small nod, the kind people share in the early morning before many words are needed. "You should eat while it's hot," she said gently. On the table sat a simple meal, his flour, his pan, his last pieces of dried meat. They had cooked without asking, yet nothing about it felt rude. It felt normal. Daniel pulled out the chair he always used and sat down. The warmth in the room was stronger than usual. The house had been cold for so long that he had stopped noticing it, but now he could feel the difference. They ate quietly, not awkward silence, just calm. The youngest glanced toward the window where snow still fell in thick lines. "Road-s gone," she said. Daniel nodded once. "Few days at least." None of them looked disappointed. If anything, they seemed relieved. After breakfast, Daniel reached for his coat to begin chores. Before he could step outside, the middle sister picked up another coat, one of his older ones hanging unused by the door, and followed him. He looked at her, confused. She spoke simply. "You showed us shelter, we help." He almost refused. The ranch work was hard even for strong men, and the cold made everything heavier. But she already stepped into the snow, leaving him no easy way to argue. Outside, the air cut sharp but bright. Snow reached nearly to their knees in some places. The cattle would need checking or they would wander and weaken. Daniel handed her a small feed bucket. He expected complaints after 10 minutes. There were none. She walked carefully, watching how he moved, copying his steps across harder ground where animals had packed the snow. When a gate stuck frozen in place, she leaned her shoulder beside his until it opened. When a calf struggled in deep snow, she steadied it while Daniel cleared a path. They spoke little, but work did not require many words. By midday, they returned. Smoke rose from the chimney stronger than he had seen in months. Inside, the other two had organized the space. Firewood stacked near the hearth, melted snow water stored in buckets. The broken shelf that always leaned sideways now held straight. Daniel noticed something else. The chair that had been pushed halfway from the table for years was now gently tucked in place. He paused but said nothing. Days passed that way. The storm kept them there longer than expected. Each morning, someone woke before him to start the fire. Each day they found something to repair, clean, or strengthen. They never asked what belonged to them and what did not. Instead, they treated the house as if it mattered. The youngest, Kaya, fixed torn cloth using careful stitches. The middle sister, Nita, worked outside beside Daniel without complaint. The oldest, Atsa, cooked simple meals but made them feel like real dinners rather than survival. One afternoon, Daniel returned from the barn to find the fence line near the yard rebuilt. Not patched, rebuilt stronger than before using spare wood he had stored but never touched. He stared at it for a long moment. Atsa noticed. Wind pushed it before, now it won't. He only nodded, yet something in his chest felt unfamiliar, not gratitude exactly, not happiness, but movement after long stillness. Evenings changed the most. They sat near the fire after dark because there was nowhere else to go. At first they spoke softly among themselves, not wanting to disturb him. Slowly, small conversations formed. Nita asked about cattle brands. Kaya asked why the mountains changed color at sunset. Atsa asked how long winter usually stayed. Daniel answered briefly at first. Then longer. He found himself explaining seasons, trails, weather signs. He had not explained anything to another person in years. Talking felt stiff in his mouth, but easier each night. One evening, Kaya laughed at something simple, the way the barn cat stole warmth near the stove. The sound surprised him so much he almost smiled before catching himself. The house no longer sounded empty, yet they never acted as if they planned to stay forever. One afternoon, Daniel saw them repairing the wagon wheel inside the barn, working slowly but carefully. "You'll leave when road's clear," he said. Atsa nodded. "We must find family south of the hills." He expected relief at those words. Instead, he felt a quiet pause inside himself, like the moment before a door closes. Snow finally softened near the end of the week. The sky turned pale blue again, and wind carried hints of warmer air. Tracks would soon be possible. That night dinner lasted longer than usual. No one mentioned departure directly, but everyone sensed it approaching. Before sleep, Daniel stepped outside alone. The stars had returned, bright over the silent land. For months, the ranch had felt like a place waiting to end. Now, with faint voices inside and light glowing through the window, it felt like something paused rather than finished. He stood there a long time before going back in. Inside, the fire burned steady. The sisters spoke quietly about the road ahead, about relatives they hoped still lived where letters once came from. Daniel listened without joining, yet he did not retreat to his room immediately. For the first time in years, he sat until the fire settled into embers, simply sharing space. The house was still small, still worn, still far from town, but it no longer felt abandoned. And though none of them said it aloud, each understood the same truth: leaving would be harder than arriving. The weather changed without warning. For several days, the air had softened, and patches of earth began to show through the snow. The sisters spent most of that time finishing the wagon wheel inside the barn, while Daniel prepared supplies for their travel. Everyone moved with the quiet understanding that the road would soon open. But late one afternoon, the wind shifted sharply from the north. Daniel noticed it first while checking the cattle near the far fence. The animals grew restless, turning their backs toward the hills. The sky, clear only an hour before, slowly filled with heavy gray clouds that pressed low over the valley. He had seen this kind of change before, not a normal storm, but a fast, bitter, cold front. He headed back quickly. By the time he reached the yard, the air already burned his face. Nita stood near the barn door holding a hammer, her hair whipping across her eyes. "Storm?" she asked. "Hard one," he replied. "Tonight." They secured the barn together, tightening rope around loose boards and pulling the wagon farther inside. The horse stamped nervously as the temperature dropped. Daniel covered it with an extra blanket, rubbing its neck until it settled. Inside the house, Atsa and Kaya had begun preparing more wood than usual. Small stacks now lined the walls near the fireplace. The room felt busy but calm, each person moving without needing direction. The first snow hit just before sunset, sharp and sideways, driven by wind that howled across the open land. The windows rattled softly at first, then harder. The fire burned high, but cold still slipped through every crack in the walls. Daniel added more logs. Night came early under thick clouds. The air inside the house warmed near the fire but stayed cold across the floor and near the beds. The old structure simply could not hold heat against such weather. They ate a simple meal, though no one focused on the food. The wind grew louder, pressing against the door in steady waves. Kaya pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Feels colder than before," Daniel nodded. Temperature falling fast. He checked the windows again, placing cloth along the edges to slow the draft. Still, the chill deepened as the hours passed. Frost began forming on the inside corners of the glass. The house only had a few thick blankets, and they were worn thin from years of use. Normally, Daniel managed by sleeping near the fire, but 4 people made it harder. Heat spread less, and the floor carried cold upward. By late evening, their breath became faintly visible in the darker corners of the room. Atza studied the space quietly, thinking rather than worrying. She moved one chair aside and brought another closer to the hearth. Then she spoke calmly. "We should sleep closer together, keep the warmth in one place." Daniel hesitated. He was used to distance, used to giving guests the best area while he managed alone. "You take the fire," he said. "I'll be fine." Nita shook her head gently. "This cold doesn't care about pride." The wind struck the house with a long, heavy push that made the boards creak. Atza continued, her tone practical, not awkward. "In winter back home, families slept side by side when cold came strong, not comfort, survival." Daniel looked at the thin blankets, then at the frost slowly growing along the wall. He understood she was right, yet the idea felt unfamiliar after years alone. Kaya smiled lightly, trying to ease the moment. "No one freezes tonight." They rearranged the sleeping space near the fireplace where warmth gathered strongest. Extra coats became pillows, folded cloth filled gaps along the floor, and every blanket was layered together. No one treated it strangely. It was simply a solution. Daniel lay down last, still unsure, but the heat held better once they settled close to the fire. The wind roared outside, shaking loose snow across the roof. Inside, the shared warmth pushed back the cold enough to make breathing comfortable again. For a long time, no one spoke. Only the sound of the storm filled the dark. Then Kaya whispered softly, half awake, "Sounds like the river in spring." Nita answered quietly, louder. Atza added, "But it will pass." Daniel listened. The simple conversation felt steady, like the fire itself, small but real. Months ago, nights had stretched endlessly, filled only with memory and silence. Now even the storm felt less heavy. The heat from the fire slowly reached deeper into the room. Exhaustion from the long day settled over them. One by one, breathing slowed. Daniel expected to stay awake as he usually did, staring into darkness while thoughts circled. Instead, the sound of steady breathing nearby grounded him in the present moment. The cold did not ache through his bones. The night did not feel endless. For the first time in years, sleep came without struggle. Morning arrived pale and quiet. The storm had ended, leaving deep snowdrifts piled against the house. The fire had burned low but steady through the night. No frost formed on the windows this time near where they rested. Kaya stirred first, stretching slightly and smiling when she saw light through the glass. "We made it." Nita sat up and added wood to the embers. Soon warmth returned stronger than before. Daniel rose slowly. His joints did not ache as they usually did after cold nights. He stepped outside to check the animals while the others prepared water. The world looked completely new, smooth white hills under a clear sky, untouched except for the barn roof where snow had slid down in heavy layers. He stood there for a moment. The ranch had always felt like something he endured. This morning it felt like something shared. Inside, the smell of warm tea filled the room. The sisters spoke quietly while working, their voices calm after the long night. Daniel closed the door behind him and removed his coat. No one mentioned the sleeping arrangement again. It did not need discussion. It had simply been what was necessary. Yet the space between strangers had grown smaller. They moved through the morning naturally, passing cups, tending the fire, planning the day's work. Outside remained cold, but inside carried a different kind of warmth, not just from the fire, but from the understanding built in a single hard night. And though none of them said it aloud, they all felt the same thing. The ranch was no longer only a place of shelter. It had quietly become a place of trust. After the storm, winter began to loosen its grip on the valley. The snow no longer fell every day, and sunlight stayed a little longer across the hills. Small drops of water slid from the roof in the afternoon, tapping softly against the ground. The world was slowly moving forward again. Life at the ranch settled into a steady rhythm. Each morning the fire was lit before the sky fully brightened. Daniel no longer woke to silence but to quiet movement, someone placing wood, someone heating water, someone opening the door just enough to check the weather. The sounds were gentle and never hurried. They worked together without making a plan out loud. Nita often joined Daniel outside. She had learned how to move around the cattle, how to stay calm so the animals stayed calm too. At first, Daniel had watched closely, ready to step in, but she listened carefully and remembered everything he showed her. Soon he no longer needed to explain each step. Kaya stayed near the house more often. She repaired clothes, sorted supplies, and found small ways to improve comfort. She stitched patches onto Daniel's worn coat where the cold had slipped through for years. When she handed it back, she said nothing, only smiled slightly when he noticed the difference. Atza managed the rest. She organized food, counted what remained, and planned meals so nothing was wasted. She understood how long winter could last and treated every grain of flour as important. Under her care, the kitchen felt less like survival and more like living. Evenings became something they quietly looked forward to. They sat near the fire after chores, warming tired hands. Conversation came naturally now. Sometimes it was simple talk about weather or animals. Other times it moved deeper without warning. One night Kaya asked, "Were there always this many stars here?" Daniel looked through the window. "Always. Just easier to notice when you stop rushing." Nita leaned back in her chair. "You've been here a long time," he nodded. "Long enough." He rarely spoke about his past, yet the words did not feel as heavy as before. The sisters never forced questions. They listened only when he chose to share. A few days later, he found himself telling them about the first year on the ranch, how difficult it had been learning the land, how mistakes had cost him livestock, and how someone had once encouraged him not to give up. He did not say her name, but the meaning was clear. No one interrupted. When he finished, Atza simply added more wood to the fire. Memories did not hurt as sharply when spoken aloud. The repaired wagon stood ready inside the barn now. Snow melted enough along the trail that tracks could hold shape again. Travel would soon be possible. Everyone understood it, even if no one said it often. One afternoon, Daniel returned from the far pasture and saw the sisters gathered near the wagon, quietly checking ropes and supplies. The sight paused him where he stood. He had expected this moment since the first day. Still, it felt closer than he was prepared for. "There'll be safe roads soon," he said. Atza nodded. "Yes." Nothing else followed. The air carried a strange stillness, not sadness, but awareness that time was moving. That night dinner lasted longer than usual. Kaya tried to describe the place they hoped to reach far south, a valley where relatives might still live. Nita spoke about finding work once settled. Atza listened, occasionally adding small details. Daniel listened too, though he said little. Later, after they cleared the table, he remained sitting while the others prepared for sleep. The fire burned low, shadows stretching across the room. "You've done more for this place than you know," he said quietly. Nita shook her head. "We only worked." He looked around the room, the repaired shelf, the stacked wood, the mended coat hanging by the door. "No, you stayed." The words surprised even him. Atza answered gently, "Sometimes staying helps more than fixing." Silence followed, but it was warm rather than empty. Days passed, each slightly warmer than the last. Snow retreated from the fields, leaving damp earth beneath. The cattle moved easier and birds returned in small numbers, their calls echoing across the open land. Daniel noticed changes in himself as well. He no longer hurried through chores just to end the day. He spoke more freely, sometimes even telling small stories about the ranch's past seasons, floods, droughts, and the year wildflowers covered the hills completely. The sisters listened with genuine interest. Their presence made ordinary moments feel noticed. One morning, Kaya placed a small cup beside him at breakfast. "You forgot to drink yesterday." He almost smiled. Someone remembering such a small thing felt unfamiliar and comforting. Later that afternoon, he repaired a section of fence while Nita worked beside him. The sun hung low, painting the hills gold. "You'll be all right when we leave?" she asked carefully. Daniel took a moment before answering. "I was all right before." She studied him, understanding the words but also what they avoided. After a pause, he added, "It'll just be quiet again." Nita nodded softly. Neither tried to pretend otherwise. That evening, the four of them sat outside briefly for the first time since winter began. The air still held chill but carried the smell of thawing ground. The sky faded slowly into deep blue. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The ranch, once only a place Daniel endured day after day, now held shared memories, small, simple ones that made the space feel alive. Soon the road would call them onward. But for now, the fire inside still burned, and the house held voices instead of echoes. Spring arrived quietly. Snow disappeared from the fields first, then from the hills, leaving behind dark earth that smelled fresh after months of cold. Small patches of green began to show near the river, and the cattle wandered farther without struggle. The road that had been hidden all winter slowly became visible again, pressed firm enough for wheels. The morning Daniel realized the ground had fully opened, he did not say anything. He simply stood near the fence longer than usual, watching the trail that led south. Inside the house, the sisters were already awake. Atsa folded blankets neatly. Nita checked the wagon ropes once more. Kaya wrapped the last of their small belongings into a cloth bundle. No one announced that it was departure day, but everyone knew. Breakfast was simple and quiet. The fire burned low because it was no longer needed for warmth, only comfort. Sunlight entered the room more brightly than it had in months, showing every corner clearly, the repaired shelf, the stacked wood, the patched coat hanging by the door. Daniel drank his coffee slowly, as if finishing it too quickly might hurry the morning. After eating, they moved outside together. The air carried the gentle sound of flowing water from the river, free from ice at last. The wagon stood ready near the barn, wheels strong and straight. Nita secured the horse while Kaya arranged their blankets in the back. Atsa checked everything once again, careful and calm as always. Daniel walked into the barn alone for a moment. He returned holding 3 small cloth bags. Each was tied carefully with simple string. He handed one to each sister. "For your work," he said. Atsa looked at the bag but did not take it immediately. "We stayed because you helped us." Daniel nodded. "And you helped me keep this place running." Nita weighed the small pouch in her hand but shook her head. "We weren't working for payment." Kaya smiled softly and pushed the bag gently back toward him. "You gave us shelter when you didn't have to." Daniel tried once more. "Road ahead may be long." Atsa stepped closer and placed the pouch back into his palm. "So was the road behind us. We managed because of kindness, not coins." For a moment none of them moved. The morning breeze crossed the yard, stirring dust where snow had once been. Daniel lowered his hand. He understood they would not accept it. Instead, he nodded once and placed the bags on a nearby post. "Then keep them here, in case you pass again." Kaya's expression brightened slightly. "We will pass again." The words were spoken simply, not as comfort but as promise. They finished preparing the wagon. The horse shifted patiently, ready to move after long rest. The road stretched open beyond the hills, clear beneath the soft sky. Before climbing onto the seat, Nita paused. "You'll keep fixing the fence alone now." Daniel glanced at the long line of posts. "Seems so," she smiled lightly. "You know we fixed the hardest part already." Atsa gave a small, respectful nod. "Take care of the land, it has taken care of you." Kaya added, "And remember to eat when the sun is high." Daniel almost laughed, a quiet sound he hadn't made in years. "I'll try." They mounted the wagon at last. The wheels creaked forward across the yard, slow at first, then steady toward the trail. Daniel walked beside them until the gate. He opened it and stepped back. For a brief second no one spoke. The moment held more meaning than words could manage. Then Atsa said gently, "Thank you for the fire in winter." Nita added, "And for trusting strangers." Kaya smiled warmly. "Next time we come, we bring stories." Daniel rested his hand on the gatepost. "I'll be here." The wagon rolled onto the open path. He watched until the shapes grew smaller against the hills. The sound of wheels faded, replaced by wind and distant birds. The ranch became quiet again, yet it did not feel the same. Daniel returned to the house slowly. Inside, the air carried faint traces of cooking and wood smoke, but now also memory. Chairs slightly shifted. Blankets folded differently than he once kept them, small signs that people had lived there, not merely passed through. He poured coffee and sat at the table. For the first time in years, he used more than one cup, not because someone sat across from him, but because the habit no longer felt painful. Days continued. He worked the fields, repaired fences, and fed cattle as always, but the silence no longer pressed against him. Sometimes he caught himself speaking aloud while working, explaining tasks as he once had. Other times he paused at sunset, remembering shared evenings by the fire. Weeks passed into months. One evening near late summer, Daniel heard distant hoofbeats along the trail. He did not rush outside immediately. Instead, he finished placing a tool back on its hook, wiped his hands, and then stepped onto the porch. 3 riders approached through golden light. They raised their hands in greeting long before reaching the gate. Daniel rested against the post, a quiet calm settling over him. The ranch was still small, still far from town, still the same land, but it was no longer a place waiting for days to end. This time, when he opened the gate, he did not feel like a man receiving visitors. He felt like someone welcoming family home.